we go. A generation ago, one of radio's most popular personalities was Paul Harvey. Everybody say his name. Paul Harvey. Some of you maybe remember him. Paul Harvey was a broadcaster for ABC Radio Network. And Paul Harvey was best known for his radio segment called The Rest of the Story. And what Mr. Harvey would do on that particular segment is he would give factual background about people, like Elvis. He would tell you, these are the things and the steps that made Elvis famous, behind the scenes, things you never know, you didn't know. And you're like, wow, I didn't know that. He also would talk about particular phrases that, the background, the factual background for particular phrases like, ooh, it's a doozy. He would go find out where that came from and why they say it, and he would give you the factual information. He'd give you the factual information for businesses like UPS and the background of how they started, how the guy that started it used to work for the Postal Service and said it really would be nice if things could be faster, they could be delivered to your door, and how he started the big UPS corporation. And so Paul Harvey used to do that, and I used to love listening to him as a kid. And then Paul Harvey would always end his program by saying, and now you know the rest of the story. He'd say, this is Paul Harvey. That's how he'd say it, exactly like that. It was so awesome. Well, listen, I'm not Paul Harvey, but I do want to provide you today with a factual background for the book of Luke. So here it is. You heard about Luke the Gospel. You may have even read the book of Luke. But here is the rest of the story. You ready? Luke was not one of the 12 apostles. Everybody say not. He was not one of the 12 apostles. In fact, he wasn't even a B-apostle. He wasn't at all. Luke wasn't even a believer in Jesus when he first started. When he was writing this, he wasn't even a believer. Luke grew up as a Gentile. No religious affiliation, no religious background. Gentiles basically lived, they didn't believe in God, they believed in idols, they worshiped idols, they lived by the lusts of their flesh. That was Luke. He lived that way, grew up that way. Well, Luke became an adult, and he ended up going to college in Tarsus. That's a city in Turkey. I don't know if he was from Turkey. I don't know where he was from exactly. We don't know. But he went to college in Turkey, and he received an MD. And so he started practicing medicine. Everybody say Dr. Luke. So here is this guy who's not a believer in Jesus, who has lived his life just by the lusts of his flesh, and he goes to college, he gets a degree, he becomes a doctor, and he's now practicing medicine. Now listen, at that time, during this culture, the time of Luke's writing, the Romans ruled the world. And because the Romans ruled the world, they could go at any point in time and take any non-Roman and make them their slave. They could make them work for them, and because you were a non-Roman, you couldn't fight it, because you'd have to fight the power of the world. So here's what happened. Luke, being a doctor practicing medicine, ended up, apparently, he was bought as a slave and employed as a personal physician by a wealthy Roman that had a high-profile position. This guy must have been a governor or a mayor or a magistrate, and he looked at Luke and said, I need a personal physician, and he hired him. He made him his slave. You're going to come and work for me. You're going to be my personal physician. And Luke became his particular doctor. This wealthy Roman was from Antioch, Syria, and the man's name was, and everybody say it out loud, you're getting it. Let's say it again. Theophilus. Let's say it. Theophilus. That was his name. Theophilus. So this wealthy Roman Theophilus hires or makes Luke his slave to be his personal physician. Now, Theophilus is a really cool name. Here's what it means. The name means lover of God. Everybody say it. Lover of God. I think it's really cool. It's a really cool name. In fact, when I was thinking about what we'd name our church, this came to my mind. Theophilus, lover of God, Calvary Chapel. Wouldn't that be awesome? But then I started thinking about our northern New Mexico accent and how we tend to sing our words. You know how that goes. And I thought about inviting people and how that would sound. Yeah, come on over to Theophilus Fellowship, Theophilus Calvary Chapel. Do you hear what that sounds like? Theophilus Calvary Chapel? Are you serious? I said, maybe not. Maybe that's not a good idea. That really won't sell. Now listen, being a Roman, this guy Theophilus, I'm sure Theophilus was not his given name. You see, more than likely, Theophilus changed his name after he became a Christian. Here's a FYI, everybody said, FYI, for your information. At the time that Luke started drafting this narrative, Theophilus was a Christian, but Luke was not. Because that information is so important to the rest of the story, I want you to hold that thought. Hold that thought. The thought is, Luke was not a Christian when he started writing this book. The guy Theophilus that he worked for was a Christian. All right? So with that in mind, how did Theophilus become a Christian if he lived in Antioch, Syria? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Here's the background as we hold on to that thought. 20 years earlier, at Jesus' ascension, when he's finally leaving this earth, he told his followers to wait in Jerusalem for the promised Holy Spirit. Jesus said the Holy Spirit will empower you to go into all the world. Everybody say it. Where? All the world and preach the gospel. So he said the Holy Spirit's going to anoint you to be able to preach the gospel in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth. Because that's what Jesus wanted. He's going to empower you to be able to go tell the story about me, Jesus said. So that's what I want, and that's what I want you to do. And exactly as Jesus had told them, had promised, the Holy Spirit came and empowered the disciples. And a church was started. And it started blossoming. Because as they were preaching about Jesus, on one day, 3,000 people came to Jesus. On another day, 2,000 people came to Jesus. So the church was really booming. Only problem is that the disciples were huddling in Jerusalem instead of dispersing like they were supposed to. They weren't going out into the rest of the world. They were keeping the message of faith within Israel. So right there we can stop and say, ooh, forget it. Everybody say it, come on. Yeah, that's a bummer. Jesus told them to go out and they wouldn't do it. They stayed there. Now, because they had gotten comfortable, God saw that some motivation is required. Everybody say it out loud. Some motivation is required. So here's what happens. God allowed persecution to escalate against the Christians there in Jerusalem. They didn't want to move, so God says, okay, I guess I'm going to, some motivation for them to move is required. So he allowed persecution to come into Jerusalem. Both Herod and Saul started hunting, imprisoning, and even murdering Christians in Jerusalem. And so what's known as the diaspora began. The dispersion. Everybody say it, the what? The dispersion. Christians began leaving Jerusalem, kind of like the way Floridans are leaving, Florida because of the hurricane. I mean, man, let's get out of Dodge quick. And so that's what they were doing in Jerusalem. They're going to kill us. We're going to put us in prison. Let's get out of here so we can practice our faith in peace. Well, some of these Christians that were moving out of Jerusalem landed in Antioch, Syria, where Theophilus was a dignitary, a magistrate, a governor, whatever he was, but they ended up there in Syria. And guess what? While they were there, the gospel began to be proclaimed amongst the Gentiles there in Syria. There's a good room for a cheer right there. Everybody say, woo, yeah. Because finally the gospel is getting outside of Jerusalem to where it's supposed to be. And it ends up in this Antioch, Syria place. Now I want to pause right there and say this. Listen guys, sometimes we see persecution as the enemy pressuring us. But sometimes it's the Lord pushing us out of our comfort zones. Look at your neighbor and say, isn't that the truth? I got it. So here's what we need to do. Whenever we face persecution, we need to stop crying and everybody say it. Yeah, go ahead. Tell your neighbor that. Get your butt in gear. Tell them, stop crying, get your butt in gear. But more than that, you got to tell yourself. So go ahead and make that mental note. Tell yourself. Now, these displaced Christians from Jerusalem that were now in Syria started sharing the gospel there. And they shared the gospel with Theophilus. I don't know, maybe they took him a balloon, they invited him to church, and, whatever it is. But they invited him to church. And Theophilus heard about Jesus. He heard about Jesus' immaculate conception. He heard about Jesus' miracles, about his power over sickness, how Jesus cured the incurable. He heard about Jesus' power over demons, how Jesus had power over nature, how he turned water into wine, multiplied bread, a little boy's lunch, and fed thousands, how he calmed storms. Theophilus heard all this. Theophilus heard about Jesus' messages of repentance and salvation and forgiveness. He heard, he heard about Jesus' messages of surrender and discipleship. Theophilus heard about Jesus' sacrificial death, resurrection from the dead, and ascension. And with all this, Theophilus believed and came to a saving faith in Jesus Christ there in Antioch, Syria. Everybody, there's another big place for a cheer. Everybody cheer. Woo! Isn't that awesome? This dignitary, this important figure, this important icon of the city, that's the reason God wanted to get the message out, to be able to save everyone that he possibly could. And this guy heard the message about Jesus and he believed. And he came to Christ. Now Theophilus, just like Jesus described, because Jesus described that when we first come to him, when we first surrender our life to him, something happens on the inside. We become transformed, we begin to see things differently. But here's the next thing Jesus said. You will have a hunger and thirst for righteousness. How many of you have experienced that? Anybody here? Holy smokes. No wonder those 9 o'clock people have been talking about you. Well, that's what happened to Theophilus. I mean, man, he wanted to know, he wanted to learn more about Christ. The more he heard, the more he wanted to learn. He had a hunger and thirst for righteousness. He absorbed the Christian teachings. He assimilated the messages. And he amended his lifestyle. That's when he probably changed his name to Lover of God. Because before, I don't know what his name was, Sam, Robert, Fred, whatever his name was, whatever he identified with before, his name, he didn't want to identify with that anymore. He wanted to leave that behind. And he said, from now on, I want to be called Lover of God. Doesn't that sound awesome, guys? So this guy had a real true experience and relationship with Jesus Christ, this guy, Theophilus. But at some point, now he's a Christian. Luke is his doctor, still works for him, a slave, unbeliever, but he has become a Christian. Now, at some point, Theophilus, in his new walk with Jesus, began wrestling with this. Everybody say it out loud. Everybody say it again. Doubt. He began wrestling with doubt. Have you ever grappled with doubt? You know, doubt sneaks in and kind of plants pipe bombs in your mind. Questions and uncertainty and suspicion and confusion kinds of just explode on the inside of you. Kind of like if you ever received a random text from your spouse, if you were to receive a random text from your spouse that said, I love you too. Huh? Oh, you're getting it now, right? Huh? Wait a minute. Right, that creates suspicion. That's the way doubt works. Just that little suspicion, it just comes in and it grabs you. something that caused suspicion. Well, guys, maybe I even lost my place. Doubt instigates thoughts like, is what I'm believing and following really true? Is this just a religious scheme that, pastors and preachers do to get a following and make money? Oh, is this Jesus guy really true? Or else we say, oh, and by the way, wasn't the Bible written by just mere men? I mean, after all, doubt. Everybody say it out loud. What? Doubt. We've all experienced it. Doubt. It instigates those questions. Well, guys, I don't want you to be ashamed of those questions or doubts. We eventually all face them. Sometimes they come out of nowhere. Sometimes they're provoked by others. But the doubts are real. And if they're left unanswered, they will shipwreck your faith. I want you to know that. See, everybody has doubts. The thing is, what do we do with a doubt? If we just let it keep bouncing around in our head like a pinball machine, that doubt will continue to grow and develop. Questions aren't answered. Suspicions aren't doused, aren't put out. And so what happens is that doubt continues to grow. Well, guys, it'll cause a shipwreck to our faith. In fact, here's how James said it. James chapter 1, verse 6. Read it out loud with me. He who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded and unstable in all of his ways. That's exactly what doubt does. Doubt creates this instability in your faith. It creates this instability in what you believe. And therefore you stay confused and a little suspicious, and I'm not sure, and I'm a little apprehensive, and I won't jump in, and I won't commit fully because I have got doubt. And if I leave it there, it'll even do worse. It will sink me spiritually. Because here's another time. When Peter, if you remember, when Peter was walking on water, remember Jesus was walking on the sea, there was a huge storm, and Peter sees Jesus and says, if you can I come out there? If you're really him, can I come out there and walk with you? And Jesus said, come. Remember that? And so Peter climbs out of the water and he starts walking, but then he sees the wind and the seas and he starts to sink. And here's what it says, Matthew chapter 14. Watch what happens. Read it with me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said, you of little faith, said, why did you doubt? You see how? In other words, doubt will sink you. Doubt will put you under the water. Doubt will drown you. Right? It will do it. Maybe you've been like Peter. Maybe you jumped out to walk with Jesus only to be blindsided by fear and doubt. And now you're taking on water like a submarine with a screen door. I mean, there you are. I'm so confused. I don't understand. I'm trying to get my arms and my head around it because of all the doubt. Well, guys, it was the wind and the waves that fueled Peter's doubt. Well, Theophilus had attacks of doubt. But his attack wasn't the wind and the waves. His attack was probably Greek mythology. Everybody say it out loud. What? Why would that be? Watch this. See, during that culture, when Theophilus was a Christian, Greek theology and stories of demigods who were both human and divine were everywhere. You know, Hercules, Achilles. They were sons of the gods, but with supernatural powers. And those were being, praised and publicized throughout all of the world. Supernatural Greek heroes were being talked about. And guys, and so if you really stop and think about it, Jesus' story seems pretty similar to that. I mean, the Son of God that does all these miracles, both human and divine, it sounded so much like Greek theology. And that's what created Theophilus' doubt. Because here's the thing, those gods of the Greek mythology were myth. They were legend. They were fables. There was no, everybody say the word here. There was no what? There was no evidence that they ever lived, these Hercules and Achilles. There was no historical or archaeological evidence. There were no eyewitness accounts, just the stories. If some historian wanted to follow and find out if Hercules was real and where he lived and who his parents were and who his best friend was and where he went to school, they couldn't find it. Nobody knew. I don't know who he is. We know who he is, but I know he's supposed to be from this town, but go ask my grandpa. Grandpa doesn't know. Nobody knows. That was the thing about Greek mythology. These stories of demigods who were both human and divine with supernatural powers, they were myths. They were fables. Thus, the word mythology. You guys get it, right? So, Satan may have used Greek mythology to whisper doubt into Theophilus' ears. I mean, what if? How about? He was asking, is what you've been told about Jesus true? Because stop and think about it. I mean, there would be a legitimate doubt in Theophilus' mind. I've never seen Jesus. I didn't know Jesus. I don't know anything about him. I just have heard the stories just like these Hercules and Achilles. So can I really believe? And then you know that if you start doubting who Jesus is, then everything Jesus says comes into question. About heaven, about hell, about being a light, about blessings, about God's goodness, about God's grace. Am I right? So what does that do with all of your Christian faith? The doubt begins to take away all of the flesh from it. It begins to pull all of it down. And so that's exactly where Theophilus was. But instead of becoming a basket case of confusion, Theophilus decided to get to the bottom of it. All right, well, I don't know this about Jesus, and yes, my faith is now in question. So Theophilus commissioned Luke to investigate the story of Jesus. He was the most educated man. He was a doctor. He had a lot of understanding, and he was very capable. So Theophilus told Luke, who was his professional physician, I want you to go do an investigation. I want you to become an investigative reporter, and I want you to go find out if this Jesus really existed. So now Luke is going to be like Walter Cronkite or Anderson Cooper or Larry Barker on Channel 13, investigating and becoming an investigative reporter. And Theophilus asked Luke to find out if Jesus is a real person. Were there any witnesses to Jesus' life? And is he who he said he was? So listen, that's what Theophilus tells Luke. And Theophilus was more than just telling Luke, we'll check it. We'll check it. He was doing more than that. We'll check it. He was doing more than that. He was sending Luke to dig, to gather information, to track down sources, to interview witnesses, to document the details, to double check the stories, and bring back the findings. Are you with me? So Theophilus asks Luke to go do that. So Luke, this educated unbeliever that doesn't believe in Jesus, takes on the mission to prove if Jesus was and is, in fact, the Son of God. And this was probably Luke's promo. Here it is. You got a promo. See, News 1, Dr. Luke investigates. He's got a promo. So Luke got on the mission, and he starts going, and probably his theme song was, could you hear Luke singing? Who are you? I really want to know. That whole thing. That's Luke. I want to find out who this is. Now, Luke ended up getting on the field there in Jerusalem, there in Israel, and interviewed the characters that were in and around Jesus' story. He interviewed family and friends. He interviewed followers of Jesus and foes of Jesus. He interviewed those that were healed by Jesus. He interviewed those who had, actually were part of the group when Jesus multiplied the bread. He interviewed all these people constantly going around. And he even got himself, everybody say this word, everybody say what? Eyewitnesses. Say it again. Eyewitnesses. eyewitnesses. Do you know how important an eyewitness is? Did you know that in court, an eyewitness is the ace in the hole? Huh? Because if you commit a crime and nobody saw you, and there's hardly any evidence, you know what? You can get off scot-free. Nothing they can do. There's no proof. You're like, yes. But if somebody says, well, wait a minute, I was there. I saw it. I videoed it on my iPhone. Here it is. Look, 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 look. I saw him do it. An eyewitness account will bury you. How many of you know that? Yeah. Eyewitness accounts are like, hey, listen, if there is an eyewitness, some of you are getting pretty quiet like you've done something wrong, but anyhow, I'm a little worried about that. Anyhow, an eyewitness account is really devastating. See, most of you might remember John Gotti, all right? John Gotti was the notorious mafia crime boss from the Bronx. For 20 years, the New York District Attorney and the FBI were investigating John Gotti. And on many times they had Gotti dead to rights. On many indictments, they had him. They thought they got him. They got it done. But each time, cases were dismissed. In fact, they were dismissed so many times that the New York Times named John Gotti the Teflon Don, because nothing sticks. You know what I'm saying? That's what they said. That the Teflon Don. He's always in court, but never convicted. But then, in 1992, the FBI secured an eyewitness. Everybody say it or what? Yeah. The eyewitness was Gotti's right-hand man, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gravano gave detailed testimony with corroborating evidence that John Gotti murdered Paul Castellano for the leadership of the Gambino crime family. The eyewitness evidence put Teflon Don behind bars for life. Eyewitness. Before there was no proof, but now there was an eyewitness. Proof can be damning, can't it? Look at your neighbor and say it out loud. Proof can be damning. So stop and think about it. You can dismiss, deny, reject that Jesus is the divine Son of God who gave himself as a sacrifice for us. But even if you're the king or the queen of denial, it won't change the evidence. It won't change the truth. Isn't that the truth? In fact, here's how Jesus put it. Let's read it. John chapter 12, verse 44. Jesus shouted to the crowd, "If you trust me, you are really trusting God. For when you see me, you are seeing the one who sent me. I have come as a light to shine in this dark world so that all who put their trust in me will no longer wander in darkness. If anyone hears me and doesn't obey me, I am not his judge now. For I have come to save the world and not to judge it now. But all who reject me and my message will be judged at the day of judgment by the truth I have spoken." You know what he's saying? Jesus said, if you neglect the evidence that can free you today, it will come back and put you in prison forever during the judgment. Proof will be damning. This proof of who Jesus is. And so, listen, the proof can be damning. But on the other hand, proof can be, and everybody say this word, liberating. Let's listen. If the proof is provided and you deny it and reject it, it's still proof. And you're going to end up being, put out. But here's the next thing. For those who believe the truth, it can be, and everybody say the word again, liberating. For everyone who has doubted the validity of Jesus, whoever is questioned whether what they've learned about Jesus is really true. When you have proof, when you have evidence, the chains of doubt are broken, aren't they? You can put a period at the end of doubt because, hey, I've got proof. I've got evidence. So guys, you can actually say bye-bye to doubt. Everybody says, and wait, go ahead, wait, bye-bye doubt. Woo, there you go. Hey there. Proof and evidence of who Jesus is. That He is the true Son of God. All of the proof. If I have proof, then I can say goodbye to doubt because it puts an end to it. Now, proof declares, guys, that Jesus is the real deal. All right? Luke, here's what he did. He gathered all of the case files and he reported all of his findings. Every person he interviewed, everything that he did, all of the truth that was out there. He got all the case files and reported all of his findings to Theophilus. And he said, Jesus is not a myth. Jesus is not a legend. He's not a spirit. He's not a phantom. He's not an angel. Jesus was and is both human and divine. He is the Son of God. I have the evidence and the proof. These things that you've been, Luke told Theophilus, these things that you've been instructed as a Christian about Jesus, they are all. And here's the word. Everybody say it out loud. True. Woo! Yeah, go ahead and give the Lord a clap offering. Now we can read Luke chapter 1, verse 1. Let's read it. Here's what it says. Insomuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who are from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the world delivered them to us. It seemed good to me, also having had a perfect understanding of all these things from the very first now, to write to you an, everybody say the words, orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. Now stop and think. If you could have all the proof that Jesus is who He said He was and will do everything He said He would do, if you could have all that proof, how excited would you be? Because it put an end to doubt, right? You've got the evidence, you've got the proof, you've got the eyewitness testimonies, you've got all the stuff. Well, this is what Luke is saying. I have done the legwork and I am providing you with the proof. Luke states, I have combed through the evidence. The eyewitness evidence, the documentary evidence, the corroborating evidence, the rebuttal evidence, the psychological evidence, the circumstantial evidence. I have combed through it all. And I wanted to write to you an orderly account. Say those two words again. Orderly account. I want to write to you an orderly account about Jesus from beginning to end. I've gone through all the stuff. And so now I've put together an orderly account and I'm presenting it to you from the beginning of Jesus to the end. Now, the Greek word for orderly account is autopsia. There it is on the screen. We get our word autopsy from it. So Luke was saying, I am providing an in-depth and scrutinizing investigation that provides answers and reasons for your faith. Now, I don't know if you've ever watched an autopsy. I have. It's gruesome. It's gross. But here's what I learned. That the medical examiner, the doctor that's doing the autopsy, he records every single step on his voice recorder. I'm making the Y incision. I'm exposing these particular things. He takes out the stomach. I've removed the stomach and I'm going to empty the contents. Observing the